Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Michael Kugelman, South Asia Program Associate for the Wilson Center's Asia Program. This event is co-sponsored by our Middle East program, so I'd like to thank Hale Esfandiari and her staff for their help. According to a UN report released just yesterday, 2,118 civilians were killed in Afghanistan last year. This represents a 40% increase from 2007 and the highest total since the Taliban's ouster in 2001. The majority of civilian deaths are caused by Taliban or other anti-government forces, but Afghans assign more blame for these deaths to Western forces. Many of you have probably heard about the latest ABC News BBC ARD poll on Afghan public opinion. In this poll, 38% report civilian casualties in their area over the past year. The survey finds that 41% of Afghans chiefly blame U.S. or NATO ISAF forces for poor targeting, while only 28% blame insurgents for concealing themselves among civilians. Now, while more civilians have been killed by anti-government forces than by the Afghan government or the U.S.-led coalition, it's true that the number of Afghan civilians killed by these latter forces has increased in the last year. In the new poll, a strong majority, 77%, deem as unacceptable civilian casualties caused by U.S. or NATO ISAF airstrikes. The risk to civilians, this majority believes, outweighs the benefit of these raids and hunting down insurgents. So perhaps we can begin to understand why Afghan views of the United States have plummeted so dramatically since 2005. Again, in this new poll, 47% of Afghans express a positive opinion toward America, which is down from 83% in 2005, and down 16 points just from last year. In 2005, 68% of Afghans said the U.S. was performing well in their country, and today that number is 32%. I also think we need to take a step back to consider the meaning of a civilian casualty. Forget the number 2,118. Just think of one. It's terrible for any innocent civilian to lose a family member, to be maimed, or to lose a home. Yet we need to keep in mind that Afghanistan is a profoundly impoverished nation where majorities cannot afford to buy food and where great numbers of people lack or cannot afford electricity. So with these existing hardships, civilian losses in war are truly devastating. So what I'm trying to say here is that the issue of civilian casualties in Afghanistan is a major problem for Afghans, for the international community, and for the United States. The good news, though, is that some terrific work has been done on tracking this issue. CIVIC, the Campaign for Innocent Victims in Conflict, has just released what I think is a truly invaluable report on this issue, which looks at what's being done to help civilians, the challenges, and what can be done better. So I'm very grateful to CIVIC, and especially to Sarah Holwinski and Erica Gaston up here with me for offering to bring their report to the Wilson Center today. I'm going to turn things over to Sarah in just a minute. She's CIVIC's executive director. But just very briefly, I'll say a few words about Erica, who's going to be briefing us on the report, as well as our commentator, Dennis Cox. You should have a flyer in front of you which lists biographical information. So I'll be brief. Actually, I'll be extremely brief. Erica has been in CIVIC for the last year, doing a lot of work on civilian issues, and prior to that, she graduated from Harvard Law School, where she did a variety of interesting work with various groups at Harvard and elsewhere. And Dennis Cox is a senior policy scholar here at the Wilson Center. He had a long career in the U.S. Foreign Service with important positions in India and Pakistan, and he's published a variety of material and several books on South Asia. So I'll now turn things over to Sarah.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to be extremely brief also, and I hope that you don't take my brevity for glossing over the nuances of this incredibly complicated situation on the ground in Afghanistan. There are military issues, humanitarian issues, development issues, civilian governance, rule of law issues. All of those are incredibly important. What we at CIVIC do is look at the civilian perspective, the human cost issue of this conflict. I'm just going to give a bit of context for why we wanted to do this report and why we were there. So CIVIC, founded in 2003, has always been concerned about the civilian cost of war and tries to get warring parties to make amends to the civilians that they harm. In Afghanistan, we've been calling since the beginning for compensation, recognition, apologies to any civilians harmed by U.S. or international forces. International forces have been a little slow on the uptake when it comes to doing that. And it's just in the past year or 2 years that we've seen government officials, military officials, coming out with statements about compassion, humanity, and mostly hearts and minds. Everyone understands the hearts and minds that has now become a cliche, particularly around Washington. So what does this mean, hearts and minds? Well, we think that it means two things. There's a moral imperative to not only avoiding civilians, but to doing the right thing when civilians are harmed. We as a nation stand for compassion and humanity, and we talk about that quite a bit. What does it mean on the ground? Are civilians actually dignified when they are harmed? And second, there's a strategic imperative, and that's what you've seen in the Army Field Manual, in the COIN operations, the counterinsurgency operations rhetoric. Hearts and minds means winning over the local population to further your mission. And what we've seen in Afghanistan and what this report has really shown is that we are losing Afghanistan one civilian at a time. Now, this past year, CIVIC, a very small organization with a small budget, was fortunate enough to receive a Harvard fellow, Erica Gaston. And we've had her living on the ground in Kabul for the past year. She has done some tremendous work, and it's all in the report that's in front of you. We're extremely proud of this report, and she's really done all of the heavy lifting. So I'm now going to turn it over to her. And my thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center, and particularly to Dennis for being a commentator on this, and to Michael for helping organize.
Good afternoon. I'm Erica Gaston, and thanks everyone for coming out on such a really horrible weather day. I really appreciate you coming out here and showing your interest in this topic. As Sarah said, I've been living in Kabul for the last year, working pretty much to put this report together, and so it's obviously really important to me, and it's really important to all of the families that I've spoken to. So I really appreciate you coming out here and taking such time to look more closely at this issue. So the title of our report is Losing the People. I think what we're trying to do with this report is give a bit of more of a sense of what goes behind the civilian casualty numbers that you read about every day. So like Michael said, the recent UN report said 40% increase in civilian casualties from 2007, over 2,000 civilians killed. You know, I think we need to look a little bit beyond that and say, what happens? What's beyond the 2,000 number? What happens to each of these families that lose a loved one, that lose a home, that are injured or disabled permanently for their life? And what can we do to make that better? So first, just, to give us some context and some background on what's happening, like we said, over 2,000 civilian casualties in 2008, well over 8,000 since 2001. The vast majority of these families receive no compensation, no assistance, most of them not even a basic apology. Also, just to give you a bit more of a context, as we said, the primary cause is due to insurgent forces. 724 of the two suicide attacks, so that's a good third of the number of civilian deaths in 2008. Airstrikes also are a serious cause of civilian losses. There's also increasing intimidation and specific targeting by insurgent attacks. There are more one-off incidents where you have escalation of force and military convoys and checkpoints. And then, of course, in Afghanistan, you still have, not just from the ongoing conflict, but from the past 30 years of conflict, continuing issues with landmines and other explosive remnants of war. Not surprisingly, given these losses, I think, and the lack of compensation or recognition, the international community really is losing ground in the war for public perception there. Each family that suffers such a loss can become a catalyst against the international community's mission there. In 2006, 83% of Afghans had a favorable view of U.S. military forces, and that's dropped by 15 points since 2006. It's true that that international forces are not responsible for the majority of deaths, but they get blamed a lot more than insurgent forces because there are higher expectations for international forces. So this is just, I'm sure you hear a lot of these things about numbers, and you hear about hearts and minds, you hear about the strategic imperative. I really just wanted to try and give a bit of a sense of what families are actually saying. Like when I go in and I talk to these families in their living room, what are they telling me about international forces or about what happened to them? So this is a family that are IDPs, internally displaced persons from Helmand province, one of the most conflict-prone provinces in Afghanistan. They suffered continual airstrikes, continual fighting. They had Taliban go into their village and were firing from their village, and U.S. forces retaliated, and they fled to Kabul. And so I was talking to them about 2 weeks after this happened, and they told me that one of the leaders of the camp told me, we've suffered fighting now for 30 years, and we've never left. It's never been this bad, and we finally just decided we can't take it anymore. And the blame for that, they did attribute some blame to the Taliban because they said they're firing from our villages, but we also blamed the soldiers who bombarded us, and we received no compensation and no help from them. A solution that CIVIC has been advocating since 2003 is to provide some form of help where you've harmed. Compensation is expected and demanded in Afghanistan. That's not the case in every conflict zone, but within the culture in Afghanistan, compensation is an accepted form of providing amends. Also, I think it's important to remember that most of the amounts you're talking about for compensation, which I'll get into a little bit more specifics a little bit later, are not very much. Often it's $2,000. It's really an insignificant amount compared to what we spend every year on military and other sort of hearts and minds initiatives. So really quickly, just to give you a sense of what I'm going to talk about for the next 10 minutes and hopefully still leave lots of time for commentary and questions. First, what are the expectations and the needs of affected families? Second, what sort of programs and support mechanisms already exist, and what do civilians think about them? Do they think that, they just wanted apologies? Do they want actual material help? Do they want monetary help? What are they saying about this? And not only in terms of what helps them physically or what helps them recover financially, but what makes them, do they get anything that gives them sort of emotional closure or redress from this? Do they have anything that they say, yes, I felt like some justice had been done to my family? So we're going to be looking at kind of both sides of that question. And then finally, a few conclusions and recommendations for going forward. So first, just to give you a little bit of a sense of, the methodology and where we're coming from on this, we conducted 143 interviews with civilians. We tried to get to as many provinces as we could, and we also tried to get to talk to civilians who were affected back in 2001, as well as those who were affected as late as fall 2008. And one of the reasons that we wanted to do that is we wanted to get a sense not only what are the costs for these families immediately after an incident happens, but what are the costs for them a year later or 2 years later? How does this continue to affect them? And also, if they received help, how does the help really help them recover immediately or in a longer term sense? So we just asked them basic questions about what happened to your family, how has your life been affected by this, who did you receive help from and why? And did this aid change the way you felt about the incident? What we found broadly was that it was important to families to have both the kind of the physical and the financial help, to be given immediate medical treatment, to be helped in terms of recovering from the costs of an incident, but also that many of them did ask for some sort of this emotional redress. A lot of them said, if they had received aid for their family that, for example, helped them with their business or, money in the form of condolences or compensation, a lot of them still said, yes, but we just wanted an apology as well. So try and reflect that a little bit in the next few slides. Obviously, we tried to also make sure that we covered civilians who were affected by a variety of different ways by the conflict. So the most prominent, of course, is loss of a family member. And those that lose a family member, beyond the emotional suffering, a lot of them struggle because they don't have livelihood support, particularly widows and orphans. They have high immediate funeral and medical expenses that can put them in debt for years. And given the high poverty in Afghanistan, it's often really hard for them to recover from something like that. This man that's pictured here, his son was a translator for U.S. forces, and he was killed in a suicide bomb attack on Bagram Air Base in 2007. And just to give you a sense kind of these emotional issues that I was talking about, what he said was, people had collected all the body parts and put them in a bag. They were the ones who came by. No officials came, no military. No one from the U.S. has come or has said anything. Another serious issue, of course, are those that are injured. For everyone that's killed, as many or more are injured. And many of those struggle in the same way to support their families when they can't make a basic livelihood. They also struggle from medical costs that put their families into debt and just from continually living with a disability. These two young men were both injured by cluster munition incidents in the west of Afghanistan, and they are permanently disabled. As you can see, I think, from the slide, neither of them are able to walk. One of them has severe injuries to his leg, and the other one, his legs were amputated. Another issue, of course, is property loss when they lose a home, farms. It's really devastating for many Afghan families. This man that's pictured here, actually, there was an incident in March 2007 where U.S. Marines fired in response to a suicide bombing, and they fired instead and hit many civilians. This man found 1,250 bullet holes in his car from that incident, and his father was killed, as was his niece. And just to give you a sense of the range of, I was mentioning emotional redress and justice. Sometimes they say they just want an apology. Sometimes they say they actually want justice. And so I wanted to include this quote just to give you a sense of the range. So this man said, we want a trial of those who are doing this to civilians. I'm disappointed by coalition forces. If they're here for peace and prosperity, that is good. But if they come here to cause these killings and bombardments, then there's no reason to be here. And then finally, one more category are those who are displaced by the conflict. 44,000 civilians were displaced in the first half of 2007 alone, for many of them for weeks, some of them for years. This quote is from a man who was in the Shindan Valley. Many of you who follow Afghanistan may have heard about the big airstrike in the Shindan Valley in August 2008. And he was telling me, my two brothers were killed in this incident. The international forces, the government, they know we lost our people, our property, our house, our livestock, but do they try to assist us? And then finally, I just wanted to give a sense, of course there are these individual losses, but particularly as we talk about development and stabilization issues in Afghanistan, it's important to keep in mind the broader community impact that this has. When many members of the same community are killed, when a community property is destroyed, not only does it take away kind of the social support network for individual families, but it makes it really hard for that entire community to go on, even for those who aren't directly affected. This girl here, I think she was 12 years old, and her parents were killed in a bombing in July 2008 in the eastern region of Afghanistan. She and two of her other sisters are now living in an orphan's home because they don't have any other means of support. And I talked to a couple other members of her community. These quotes are actually not from her herself. She was very shy and she didn't really want to talk very much about what had happened. But I talked to some other elders in her community, and I thought it was really telling that their reaction to the incident itself was, people believe ISAF just pours salt in the wound because of how they acted. People are angry because no representative from ISAF came to see what happened or to apologize that it was a mistake. So now that I've tried to give you a little bit of a sense of what civilians are saying when these incidents happen, I just want to give you a broad overview of some of the programs that can help them and kind of what civilians think about them. More detail on each of these programs is in the report. I'm really just going to try and gloss over them in a few issues, and hopefully if you're more interested more in depth, you can read a bit more in the report or just bring it up in question and answer. So excuse me if it seems a bit cursory going through all of the next part. We focused on three broad categories of aid. assistance from international military forces, assistance from foreign government actors, and from the Afghan government actors. Really quick, international military forces often do provide immediate medical assistance on the site if civilians are injured, for example, by a suicide bombing. Less so for an airstrike because they're often not on the ground providing it. But it's important to note because a lot of civilians actually were really grateful for the medical care. Some of them also provide broader support through the PRTs or through the ISAF headquarters. These are a bit more controversial. A lot of humanitarians object that this is really eroding humanitarian space in Afghanistan. And at least from our research, we didn't find that civilians felt like, at least they didn't note it to us. It doesn't mean it didn't have an impact, but they didn't say, we saw this as a way of atoning for our losses. The more important category perhaps in this is compensation and ex gratia payments. I think that's more what you hear about or what you have a sense of what the international military might do, and it's also a bit less controversial among humanitarian groups. These are most, I'm going to go into detail a bit more on the next slide on this, but most international military forces have some means of providing compensation or ex gratia payments. In terms of foreign government actors, the only program we found sponsored by the Civilian Agency of Foreign Governments was the Afghan Civilian Assistance Program, which is funded by USAID and implemented by IOM. This was really one of the unique programs that we found when we were doing our research, just because it had among the broadest reach. What it does, it doesn't provide immediate monetary funds, but it provides kind of tailored livelihood assistance. So once they identify a family, and they do try and go back to 2001 and identify every family affected by international military forces, whether directly or indirectly. And once they've identified a family, they go to them and they say, what do you need to get back on your feet? Do you still have medical conditions? Do you have medical bills you need paid, or you need continuing medication? Do you need to restart your business or expand it so that you can better support your family? For things like, a lot of times they'll do vocational training. So if you have a widow who can't support her children, they might do something like a tailoring school or a beauty cosmetics or something else that's appropriate for her within the community but allows her to have some independence. And they also do some community support as well, where there's been an incident that affected a community at large. Then finally, the Afghan government does have two programs. One of them by the Ministry of Labor, Social Affairs, Martyrs, and the Disabled. It's so far very small, and it was plagued by, I think, a lot of corruption problems. It's an old program. It's been there since the Taliban time, and a lot of the people that were on the roster were still from the 1990s, whereas they didn't do a good job necessarily of updating the roster. So it has a lot of potential. It would generally give like sort of a $10 a month to the dependents of someone who's killed in conflict. So kind of a continuing support mechanism, but unfortunately we only found one civilian out of the 143 we interviewed who actually got that. So it's very limited. I think they're trying to change the program now, but for the moment. The other one that has a lot more reach is President Karzai has a fund, and it gives about the same amount that a lot of the ex gratia payments I'll talk about in a minute give, about $2,000, and about $1,000 for those that are injured. Particularly following the big airstrikes, this program was really good in getting in there immediately, giving the families some money and some help. It was often the quickest to respond. For other one-off incidents or for incidents involving Afghan national security forces, not so good. So the big category here is the compensation and ex gratia payments. I think it's what you hear about the most. There's no common ISAF policy on this. It's left to each international military troops to decide on their own. It is very rare to have formal compensation. There is the U.S. Foreign Claims Act, where foreign citizens can file a claim for compensation up to $100,000. But it excludes most injuries or types of losses you'd think of in Afghanistan. It's only for non-combat issues. And since combat is defined very narrowly, or I guess combat's defined very broadly, non-combat is defined very narrowly, but basically anything, like if a child is walking by a checkpoint and is unintentionally or mistakenly shot, that counts as a combat injury. In most cases. There's a lot more information out there. I just wanted to give you a sense that there is this type of formal compensation that's available. The UK also had one case that was brought through its formal justice system. The vast majority of payments, though, are not these legally binding compensation. They're called ex gratia payments, which means out of kindness. They are often between $1,000 to $2,000. The U.S. Salacia program and also the condolence program is a type of ex gratia payments, and it pays about $2,000 for a death. I think the condolence is $2,500. They also do cover injuries and sometimes property losses. And some of them will cover things like that were initiated by insurgents but against international forces, like suicide bombs. And some of them, like, for example, when I spoke to Canadian representatives, they told me, no, we really want to draw a distinction. We only provide ex gratia payments when it was our fault, when we caused the harm, not when a suicide bomber did. So they vary a lot. It depends on each type of country delivering them. We heard about some countries provided what they could, like soldiers scraped together out of their own pockets and gave a family $300. We heard another case where they found the money in an army budget to give a family $20,000 for the loss of 3 of their family members. So it just varies a lot. So just the takeaway I just threw at you, I know, 3 different types of actors involved in this and multiple different types of programs. In terms of what that means for civilians, let's take a best case scenario. Someone loses a loved one or someone's injured in an incident. What the best that they could hope for is they would get immediate medical relief. Maybe they get monetary payments soon afterwards through one of these ex gratia programs or through the President Karzai's fund. Afterwards, maybe they follow up livelihood, medical, or other support from ACAP. Maybe they get a bit of community support as well through one of the PRTs. And then after that, they could get continuing monthly payments from MOLSAM. So it sounds pretty good. It sounds pretty holistic. Like there's a lot that's covered there. Unfortunately, that's not always the case, or that's not often the case that they actually get all of these things or any of this help. There are a lot of challenges to providing this type of assistance. Not surprisingly, I'm sure for the many of you who have worked on Afghanistan, it's really difficult to get any program implemented, but particularly when you're talking about any sort of tailored assistance, it's really difficult. Security is always a problem. I think, especially in the last year, increasing areas of Afghanistan are off limits to many humanitarians. The same goes for military actors trying to provide compensation or other things. I spoke to one officer who was working with UK troops, and he said, if we wanted to go and provide someone compensation or ex gratia payments more accurately, what are we supposed to do? You can't just go knock on the person's door. It would require an entire troop operation just to get to that door. And that's not the case, of course, in all parts of Afghanistan, and it's not the case for all situations, but it is the case in certain provinces. And so that's an important factor to keep in mind. Corruption was also a persistent issue, particularly with the Afghan government programs. It was also a problem in that some international military try and get around security issues by implementing or giving the aid through local officials or intermediaries. And that, while it gets around security problems, might open up the door for some of these corruption issues. More generally, some of these programs suffered from issues including lack of accessibility, lack of coordination, lack of funding, and liability concerns. I'm just going to go into a little bit more depth on how that would actually impact the delivery of aid, taking, for example, the ex gratia payments that we've gone into in more depth. So lack of accessibility. Families don't know many times to go to the military to ask for help. They don't necessarily think, I have a right to this or I should go and do it. If they do, they're afraid to approach the international military often. And those who do go to the military often told me that they were turned away at the gate. In terms of how coordination impacts that, like I said, there's no common ISAF policy on compensation, and there's no standard procedure for forwarding claims on. So what that means for your average civilian is that unless they can actually identify the troops that were involved and bring the claim directly to them, they have no option or no choice of getting this compensation or ex gratia. And that's a problem particularly in Afghanistan, where you have a lot of issues with airstrikes. A lot of operations are carried out by special forces that aren't necessarily based in the province where they're suffering. So it's very hard for many Afghan families to actually get someone to listen to what happened to them, much less to be able to prove the claim or try and find the funds. And then finally, a lack of funding or workable procedures. I did say that many ISAF member countries have these funds, but not everybody does. I was talking to an aid worker down in Kandahar, and she was saying if someone is injured by a Canadian or U.S. forces, they have a pretty good shot at getting some help. If they're injured by Romanian forces, they don't really have any option. So it matters who you were injured by. Sadly, another issue is that while some troops have the funds, they have a lot more rigorous procedures for authorizing. I talked to representatives of one embassy, and they said that to get any ex gratia payments authorized, they have to get it approved through 2 ministries back in their home country. And I put this other slide up about the different ISAF member countries, the OEF forces, to just give you a sense of how daunting it would be for an Afghan to try and identify which forces were involved. I've only got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try and rocket through the rest of these slides, but hopefully we'll get some. This is just kind of an anecdote to give you. This man was shot by U.S. forces in 2003, and he had a story that kind of brought out a lot of these issues. He went to the PRT several times, and he was turned away. Then a new rotation came in, and the new rotation of troops had no record of anything that had happened to him. So once that happened, he had absolutely no chance of getting any help, and he was very angry about that in the aftermath. This slide should look like a mess to you, and it's deliberately so. And that's because if this looks confusing to you, imagine what it's like for an Afghan trying to negotiate this system and actually get help for his family. As you can see, there's a lot of just dead ends. If you were attacked by insurgents, not through suicide bombing, but through just a deliberate targeting, you have almost no chance of getting help. If you are affected by Afghan forces alone, not in a joint operation with international military, you have no choice. If you're in a province where there are such security issues that it's likely that what happened to you didn't even hit the radar of the media or other independent monitors, it's very hard for you to prove or establish that you actually are eligible for any of these programs. So just keep skipping on. Let's see. And then this is just a summary. These kind of systemic problems, the lack of coordination across the board, the issues with ex gratia payments, the issues in trying to identify civilians with security and corruption mean that for many families, they get no recognition, assistance, or compensation. Then finally, I just want to quickly touch on the issue of emotional redress and then offer some recommendations. When I was talking about the different families who were affected, many of them said, we want justice. No one came to us and apologized. Nobody came to our community and said, this wasn't our intention. So we tried to also look at how some of these programs touched on these issues of emotional redress. This is kind of the toughest issue to tackle, and it is one that I think in questions I get a lot of skepticism, because how do you really redress the loss of a family member with a $2,000 payment? It's a really tough question, and a lot of times it doesn't work. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. It really depended a lot on the individual emotional reaction of the family, what they wanted, whether it was available. But with all of those caveats, we did see some larger patterns. We did see that redress was most likely to happen where families received personal apologies, where they received some form of compensation, aid, or in-kind assistance, and where they got some sort of public mediation or public recognition. Often when troops, for example, went to community leaders and said, hey, we want to make it up to these families, what do you think is the best way to approach them? And probably most important, we found that who's giving this recognition or this aid mattered the most. There really was no substitute if they blamed international forces for their loss for international troops finding a way to meet with them or have a representative or meet with a representative of their family and say, we are sincerely sorry, this wasn't our intention. There just was no substitute for that. And then finally, just a few findings and recommendations. Almost done. Compensation and support is possible, is our overall finding, even with all of the issues that we talked about. It does happen. It's not just a pipe dream, and it's something that many Afghans really hope that we start to get better on. I think it's also important to recognize, even though I tried to focus on some of the issues in implementation, that this is a really challenging thing for any organization or actor to try to do to begin with, and they've come a long way in trying to find ways to get around the issues in delivery in Afghanistan. But we still need to get better on it. There have been recent signs of improvement. Secretary Gates has made several comments in public testimony that he wants the U.S. military to get better about responding immediately and providing compensation. And there actually have been a couple of incidents that suggest that U.S. troops on the ground are taking this seriously, as opposed to last summer when following each airstrike you had a lot of public backpedaling, public denials that there were any casualties and no responses. In November 2008, when there was a mistaken U.S. airstrike on a wedding party in Kandahar, within a week they sent representatives down there, they made sure compensation was paid, and they apologized. There were also 3 incidents in January, night raids carried out by U.S. Special Forces, and within a couple of weeks of the incidents, they went to the provinces and the communities. They assessed the damage. They apologized. So I think these are encouraging signs, and we have to hope that that they're not just a temporary fix. So going forward, I think we've put all of our recommendations in the report, and I hope you'll take the time to read them. But just overall, I would say that the real challenge is to improve coordination, ensure adequate funding and on-the-ground resources so that all victims of conflict receive equal and adequate recognition and apologies to the extent possible. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Erica. That was really quite interesting. I imagine this has prompted some questions. I know I have some, but first we'd like to let Dennis say a few words.
Well, I really want to take my hat off to CIVIC and to Erica for the marvelous job they've done in putting out information on this horrendous problem. What really started in a way, or was in any time you have a war, is a humanitarian problem, has now become a really strategic problem for the United States, reflected in the figures of the plunging support for Americans and for our involvement in Afghanistan. As we move to increasing our force levels in Afghanistan, the problem, it seems to me, is only going to get worse. And in a way, it almost it is very hard for me, at least, to envisage happy endings here, and to see how one can even in the best of circumstances, deal in the Afghan setting with these problems, as you point out, in the areas where you have fighting going on, it is difficult for the civilians to get in touch with the military, even if they know who to go to. And then in the areas where the Taliban is strong, there's the threat of reprisals, and then the patchwork quilt of vehicles for compensating people also. As you say, this all should be better coordinated, but I wonder just how can they do that? How will it in real terms? And also it doesn't help, but that's also a reality when the Afghan government fingers this problem, and Karzai repeatedly jumping on us, and no doubt correctly that one wants to avoid civilian casualties, but how in these circumstances where, in the nature of an insurgency, the insurgents are mixed together with the population, and so I would like to think that you've come up with, and I read your report with a great deal of interest, and I think there all the recommendations are good, but I just wonder how you're going to be able to make it happen, how it will happen. Publicity certainly helps, but there are so many problems in Afghanistan that we that face, of which this is just one, an important one, that I wonder whether we're going to be able to successfully address it. All one can say is that I think you're doing again a terrific service by focusing on this and by continuing to push it ahead and keep it in the public's eye. But going from there to really achieving things concrete that are going to improve the situation. And I think you point out that, as you point out, you never can replace a loss. And so the best you can do is to alleviate it a bit. And even then, it's still, it is just, a modest improvement. So I wish I could be, again, very positive about what you have done, and I wish I could feel more positive about what is really possible. But I just not. I just feel it's difficult to be so. And sadly, I admit. And I know you're going back to Afghanistan, and I do, wish you well in all your efforts, and more than well. It is, one hates to say that that you're in a no-win, sometimes on a no-win situation here, where it is very difficult to see how you can make, major improvements given the situation. Thank you.
So is this okay? Good. No, I agree. I think that there are major challenges, and I think given the security and especially all of the issues in Afghanistan, you're probably never going to get a perfect system, no matter if the patchwork gets running like clockwork and it becomes coordinated and there's an infinite amount of resources. It's just never going to get perfect. And I think the situation definitely is concerning in Afghanistan. But I think one thing to be careful about is not conflating the ability or the possibility of providing compensation and help to one family with the likelihood of our entire success on all levels in Afghanistan. Even if it's a small amount, it actually is very meaningful for a family. I think, in the one sense, one response is that everyone is suffering so much in Afghanistan. It's one of the poorest countries, and even a small amount helps families who are set back by a loss enormously. On another hand, you can say compensation, providing sort of these payments is a part of the tradition. It's part of an accepted way to atone for a loss in Afghanistan. Or even, you don't even have to take it to that sort of cultural reference. You can just say, if you were in the U.S. and you ran over someone's dog, you would say you're sorry. And that's all that a lot of people are asking for. They're just saying, recognize it. Don't deny that my family member was killed. If it's in your means, then help them out. So I think even if these simple gestures can't solve everything in Afghanistan, and even if we can't get to every single civilian, you can do a lot of good by trying to get better on this.
Okay, well, let's start taking some questions. And I just ask that you wait until the microphone arrives, and then please keep your question brief and identify yourself. So, okay, let's start. Yes, gentleman right in the back.
Is it on? Yes, it is. John Barry, Newsweek. Fascinating presentation. Have you managed to make any contact with with any of the senior U.S. military or with United Nations people about this? You mentioned, and you indeed showed Secretary Gates' comment, and I've heard General Petraeus say, we've got to get better at this, and Admiral Mullen was quite passionate about it in an op-ed in the Washington Post a few days ago. So I think you might find a receptive audience. Therefore, I ask, have you managed to make contact with anyone about this, and if so, with what result?
We have managed to make contact with some officials, particularly in Afghanistan, although we always welcome more contacts. So if you have any suggestions or email addresses, we're happy to pester them about that. And we have been working actually with the United Nations and the Afghan Human Rights Commission is also really interested in this issue. And I think what is also encouraging is that in the year that I was in Afghanistan, a lot of folks within the military leadership within the United Nations and other organizations got a lot more interested. When I first arrived last February, it was kind of like, yes, we think that's an important issue, but, is the time to deal with it now? It's kind of, tangential. We've got these liability concerns. We've got all these other issues. And I think in the last few months, you really have started to see people waking up and paying more attention to it.
If I could just add a couple of comments on that. CIVIC has been working for a long time very closely with government officials, with military, with folks on the ground in Afghanistan. And to the larger point of can we actually make a difference on this, it was with the U.S. Congress that CIVIC helped create the program that Erica mentioned, the Afghan Civilian Assistance Program now run out of USAID. We've gone to train the United States military on avoiding civilians and compensating. So we've been out to their bases and we've worked with them on that. And they've been extremely receptive of that. And we've also been pressing for a new position at the Pentagon that would focus specifically on the human cost of war before, during, and after the United States goes into any conflict. And there's been a lot of enthusiasm about that in the Obama administration. I'm not sure when it will come, if it will come, but they're definitely paying attention. So I have great hope that this is going to move forward.
Okay, next question. Yes, the woman sitting right in front of you, Bryce. Yeah.
Alexandra Kaptanska, I'm with the Fund for Peace. Thank you so much for your presentation and your remarks. I wanted to know whether there are any mental health programs to address the psychological consequences of war accessible to Afghan civilians. And do such programs find a receptive audience? Are they culturally acceptable? And are there any issues surrounding the establishment or expansion of such programs? Thank you.
I'm not an expert in mental health, so I'm not sure as well about the culturally appropriate question, but I can speak a bit to the first part of your question. There are very limited resources. I think it's been really a struggle. There are a few organizations, I think, that have tried to do it, but it's particularly mental health is something I think they've struggled in capacity building with. I know also that the USAID folks who oversee the ACAP program I mentioned were interested in seeing if they could find some way to encourage the development of mental health centers to provide it, both to refer those they directly work with, the victims of conflict, and others that are just generally suffering, because it is a huge problem in Afghanistan.
Did you have a question? Yep.
My name is Peter Gruskin. I'm a student at Johns Hopkins Science. So I was wondering, I know you guys are probably somewhat, you see it as somewhat outside of your scope to maybe criticize the fundamental aims of the war and the surge that's predicted. But I was wondering, is it somewhat necessary to examine those aims? I mean, there's a huge narcotics problem that may not be addressed that's kind of weaved into the problem of pacifying the country, so to speak, via the surge. And there's just so many issues. I mean, not many experts have exactly predicted success from the surge. So I'm wondering, this does tie in with civilian casualties, because obviously your position is that you want to minimize them. So do any of you have any comments on just the wider kind of aims and underlying goals of the war and the surge?
Well, I think the government hopes, or we hope, that by sending more troops in and doing a better job in other areas, that including with Pakistan, that in some fashion the situation will improve and we'll be able to stabilize it and eventually you move on to, I don't know whether you call it success, but move to a more stable situation. And in part they're also driven by, the administration's also driven by what the alternative is in terms of American U.S. interests.
I think also just CIVIC probably, I think that we've been focused primarily on trying to see about ways, one, to minimize civilian casualties, and second, to help them where they're harmed. I think it's probably a bit beyond our focus to talk about whether the larger strategic surge is the right decision or not. I don't know.
There are only so many hours in a day. This is a big enough one.
Let me ask a question. When we talk about the hearts and minds issue here, your time in Afghanistan and your interviews, did you come across examples, stories of the Taliban or other anti-government forces, elements of the insurgency who have helped civilians or provided aid?
We heard a little bit more. Actually, Sarah was there the year previously, and she heard a few more stories initially, like in 2001, 2002, that they were using that strategy more, especially in 2001 when they were still arguably in control of certain areas and going immediately after an airstrike and providing medical help or other in-kind aid or things like that. I haven't heard much since I was there. I heard one Afghan official told me he heard about one small group within Kandahar, like one group of Taliban, who were providing about the same amount in payments as the U.S. Suleisho or the Afghan government fund, about $2,000, to families there. But that's the only time he wasn't able to give me any kind of corroboration. It wasn't more than hearsay. So I would imagine that there are some examples of it, just because there is such a diffusion of different groups there, but I don't think that it's widespread or we would have heard a bit more about it.
Yes, the woman in the back.
Hi, I'm from Voice of America. My name is Sheila. I'm an Afghan. There is a report from NATO. They're denying that the rate of casualty is not the way UN or you are saying. Mm. And I have another question that relates to your question. When you talk to those people, did you feel any sense of the victims? Did you feel any sense of anti-Western because of the damage that they suffered, anti-American, and that's why they're going back to where Talibans are and they want them back?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think civilian casualties really do color their perception of many Afghans and their perception of international forces. That is, I mean, it's particularly so when they feel like the harm is denied or is not recognized or not any help provided. There were some cases where they seemed to, particularly when they received direct apologies and help, where they seemed to be, I don't know if I'd go as far as completely forgiving or completely okay suddenly with international forces. I mean, they were talking about the loss of their loved one, but where they seem to have kind of made peace with it and they forgave them, or they would say things like, yes, it's true they harmed my family, but they've helped and they've brought stability. Of course, there were also cases where families were still upset. It didn't matter. And that just goes to the individual experience. But yeah, I think you're right to kind of bring the two together, the fact that ISAF does often deny the number of civilian casualties, and that really does have an additional kind of exacerbating factor on negative perceptions of international forces.
Yes, the woman in the back, right? Yes.
My name is Vanessa Ortiz with the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and thank you, Erica, for your great presentation. So on this question, then, is there a correlation between the exposing and payments of civilian casualties and a reduction in mistakes being made in the field? Are you tracking that somehow? Because I would think that maybe some of this denial is coming from not wanting to be exposed of sloppiness and or soldier fatigue and things like this. So are you somehow, and maybe this is more a question for Sarah, because I see the real value in your work in helping to suppress some of the errors that are being made, of course, through exposure and payments to families. And also not just on the U.S. side, but also on the other international forces that are there that are probably more in denial because some of this is just, probably just soldier errors that no one wants to admit to. So
yeah, I mean, I do think you're right that that just tracking what happens to families does provide greater accountability. It's not, I mean, I think CIVIC has been really concerned about this issue, but I think a number of commentators, particularly in Afghanistan, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Killings, Philip Alston, was really concerned about this when he visited in this past May. The UN report that was released yesterday also had a whole section on improving accountability. So I think you're right. I think it is sort of with a view that you need to be accountable, you need to be transparent. One, to kind of demonstrate that transparency is important in sort of a development perspective, but also because it does have the potential to limit civilian casualties.
And a lot of the pushback to your other part of the question, a lot of the pushback that we've received about compensation from U.S. and international military forces is that they will look liable then for the harm. Even though these compensation payments are ex gratia, meaning it's a symbolic gesture, they don't have to do it, they're not held legally liable. When you when you go after a military target, as most of you know under international law, when you go after a military target and there are civilians that are harmed, the U.S. calls it collateral damage. It's not a violation of international law. They are not going to be held legally liable for that harm. And in Afghanistan, a lot of the forces have SOFA agreements where they're not going to be held liable regardless. Even still, what Erica has found over the past year, and we've been working with for many years, is that forces don't want to compensate because then they're going to say, well, we're going to be held legally liable. Our national laws back home don't allow us to do this because there's liability involved. We haven't actually figured out what the truth is in that, but certainly the perception is such.
Can I ask another question? Are you guys pursuing, just for funding purposes and for the payments, where the money comes from for payments, are you pursuing the arms people and the technology contractors and all of that, like all of these people that are making these systems that are contributing, are you pursuing that as culpable, possible sources of funders and compensators as well?
We are trying everything. What we would I would love to see in the new negotiations on the arms trade treaty some sort of provision that says there's going to be victims assistance and some percentage of sales, transfers, use of weapons will be included for victims. I've talked to a lot of people up at the UN. I don't see that happening at this point, but yes, we should be targeting all these folks.
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Hussein Ergani from the Turkish Embassy. Just a short question, maybe also an observation. I think it's more than something related liability, of course, but I think more than that, as was pointed out by Ms. Cox, that this is a humanitarian crisis turned to be a strategic problem in Afghanistan, and as also pointed out by Erica, that the feelings of people who suffer from those civilian casualties, they're not good, and that's why I think international community also, one of the reasons that start to lose ground and support from the Afghan society. And it's the time to have a more humanitarian look, and that's why I appreciate this study by you. My question was actually about this, difference between the figures accounted by the UN and international organizations on one hand and NATO, ISAF on the other. What are the reasons for that? Is it because of the fear of this liability, or to be kept liable financially, or it is something else? Do you have any idea? In your survey on the field. Thank you.
Yes, I think there are a variety of reasons. I think liability is definitely a concern and an issue. Not even just a kind of in a negative way. If you take, for example, any given operation, say that there are, the Aziz-Abad strike in August 2008, there was a lot of debate about the exact number of civilians that were killed. The UN estimates and the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission estimates were around 90 civilians were killed. The Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission actually came out and said, we established that there are 78 killed, and then there's these 12 ambiguous cases. The military forces eventually admitted 36. So, but just for example, let's take that there's a given number of ambiguous cases in any airstrike. Of course, the military is not going to admit any ambiguous cases. They're not going to admit anything but the limited amount because of these liability concerns. Unless they can certify that it's absolutely a civilian, they're not going to say that that was a civilian casualty, and they're not going to count it. And it's often hard to do that in Afghanistan. I mean, it really is hard to get these numbers, I think, whether it's a humanitarian or a military organization. It's customary to bury the dead within 24 hours, and often after an incident happens, no one can get in within 24 hours because there are security concerns. So there will be in any given incident a lot of gray area and a lot of these ambiguous cases. So I think that's actually, that combination is why you do get such divergence in numbers.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Steven. I'm an intern with Center for American Progress. My question is, what is the U.S. military doing right, and what are they doing wrong?
Well, in terms of compensation and ex gratia payments, actually the U.S. military, or the U.S. government in general, has been among the most generous in funding these. So in our book, they're doing that right. They're being very generous in funding, and particularly for the U.S. military, they have a lot more discretion to provide these ex gratia payments in Silesia. What they're doing wrong is that they were often a lot of issues in terms of accessibility and being proactive in giving these funds than other countries were necessarily. So while they had the most flexibility to give them and they had a lot of funding, they didn't necessarily, after an incident, go out and try and provide help or provide apologies. That is in the past. Like we said, Secretary Gates seems to be trying to change the mood on that, and they seem to have been more responsive and more proactive just in the last 2 months. So hopefully they will, that will move into their plus category as well soon.
What about militarily also? As far as the military side too, do any of you have a comment on that as far as what they are doing right or what they should do instead of the current strategy?
Yeah, well, I think I would agree with what Erica has in the report, that they should be more aggressive in in following up when there is an incident, and less bureaucratic if possible.
You didn't want anything?
No.
Okay. Sir, if you don't mind passing the mic behind you to the man sitting against the near the wall. Thanks.
I'm Ed Kenny from Handicap International. Erica, thank you for your presentation. Just a quick question about follow-up. After a family receives compensation, what type of follow-up contact happens, if any, from either ISAF or ACAP or the Karzai Fund in terms of connecting folks with whatever medical services, rehabilitation, livelihood recovery, things of those sorts? Or are there names passed on to NGOs operating in the area so that they can follow up?
I'm really glad you asked this question, because I was warned by my colleagues not to get into the weeds of program implementation, and so now you just allow me that window. So yes, this is exactly a problem with lack of coordination. The short answer is none. None of these programs really do a good job of coordinating with each other. So that's another reason, even though looks like there's lots of resources out there, it doesn't necessarily maximize the impact. So no one will refer them then to, say, Handicap International. No one will refer them to other groups that are working on disability issues or vocational centers for those who are disabled or things like that. So I think even just simple things like improving coordination between these groups would do a lot in terms of helping families without necessarily requiring more resources, just making sure they know what's available.
Next question. Oh.
Sorry, Erica, going from disability to something else. In your recommendation, did you say anything about propaganda? Because what Taliban are doing, they're using these civilian casualties, they're exaggerating to get the support. And is the military, don't you think that the military should be really straightforward and say, yes, this many war casualties, so it won't let the Taliban use it as a weapon?
Yeah, I do think that that is a real problem. The Taliban are really quick to respond to anything, and I think that they are kind of winning a lot of parts of this propaganda war. You know, immediately after an incident happened, they get to the major news wires, both Afghan and international, with their version of the story. And the military, even though I think they've been trying to be more responsive, they automatically have to go through different military procedures and administrative loops before they can say anything about an incident. And just that basic lag time means that they often lose kind of this public perception war. I think that also maybe a year ago, I think the attitudes are starting to change on this, I think. But it was also a problem that I think they didn't want to respond and admit their side of the story or admit the number of civilian casualties for fear that that would attract even more attention to it. But I think you're right that it's going to be put out there anyway by the Taliban. Once it's already hit the media radar, it's probably better to go ahead and address it quickly and get the side out.
Yes, question right up here.
Virginia Ferris with the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. On the issue of corruption, which you addressed, or at least I skimmed part of your report, which seems to be a major issue at all levels of the government, how does that figure into your compensation, and so that the families are actually served as opposed to it being money being siphoned off by middlemen or tribal elders or whoever at the various levels, so that in essence there's just a simmering frustration that nothing is happening?
Yeah, I think this was a serious issue for several of the programs that we dealt with. As you mentioned, corruption is it's a significant problem across the board in Afghanistan. And so any type of program really struggles with this, but particularly when you're talking about identifying civilians and getting them some sort of support. It wasn't just these specific compensation programs, but whether we talk to the World Food Program or UNHCR, any agency, they would say it's really hard sometimes to just get accurate numbers because local officials will conflate. They'll make up false claims in order to get more money. Also, on the flip side of that, we did talk to a lot of families who said, yeah, we were promised this, but then international forces gave it to this local leader and he took it, or he gave it to his tribe, and now I'm even more angry at the international forces. So I think you're right that it's a real issue. Some of the ways that I think they've been trying to get around it was by having, for example, the ACAP program, and some of the international military forces will have kind of their own local intermediaries that they have a relationship and they trust a bit more. And they'll try and use those to directly get to the families instead of going through the local leaders. And I think that does help to a certain extent. Within the Afghan government programs, it was a problem. The Karzai Fund, at least, what they started to do when they started to have issues with this was to start double-checking any claim with multiple different sources, both different Afghan government agencies and those outside Afghan government agencies. And I think it still was an issue in certain cases, but at least that helped them get a better sense of whether that was an accurate number and whether the aid actually got to families. And in certain cases where they'd had like a particular problem in this province or district, they would just in the end say either we send someone to the families or request them to come to Kabul, because it doesn't work anymore to just give it to those local district authorities.
I think there was a question in the back. Yes.
Hi, John Powers. I have to apologize. I came in late. But a question domestically, as there's going to be a movement amongst the concept of smart power, and a movement by the State Department to take back some of the development programs that have been sort of taken by the military in the last few years, specifically because of Iraq and into Afghanistan. Do you feel that this is a program the military may try to move off into state, or do you think there's a strong enough feeling within the military they'll want to hold on to it there?
I mean, I'm not sure whether it's something that I think the military will be attached to it just because there are a lot of commanders and troops on the ground who want the resources and want to be able to have something, both for the strategic hearts and minds level and also just, I mean, one of the surprising things for me that kind of countered my intuitions and assumptions before I went in there was that the people that really kind of got this issue the best were actually a lot of the troops on the bases. I mean, they were the ones that actually had to see what happened to civilians, and tended to have kind of this gut response of, if I can find a way to help them, I will. So I think for both of those reasons, they probably will try and keep it. And I actually think it's, not all of the type of development and military assistance probably is appropriate. It's probably good that some of that's moved to state. It's a larger kind of policy discussion beyond the scope. But I do think, for direct compensation, at least what we found was, particularly on these issues of emotional redress and making the family feel like they really had been recognized and apologized to, there really was no substitute for receiving some sort of direct apology and help from the international military they deemed responsible. So I guess I don't think it would be necessarily good to move all of it over into the state capacity.
I don't think in practical terms, I don't see how you could move it over to the State Department because it's they're not there. And you need to be on the ground. You need to be on the ground in order to carry out this program.
Isn't there going to be a movement now? Well, maybe I'm wrong, but isn't there going to be a movement now with the national security reform to start to push state back into some of these places so they play a bigger role in the development and pieces that the military has taken? I'm a military guy myself. Coming from the military side, have taken the role on because of the void there. And with Secretary Clinton and Gates both understanding there's going to be a push back some of those programs back into the state level so they can be on the ground doing them. It's going to be a long time happening, but I was just wondering if this is something that would move with it.
I don't have anything to add, but okay. Were there any other questions? No? Okay. Oh, yes, sorry. Another question up in the front here.
Yeah, have you seen any cases where somebody whose family member was killed, where they actually joined to fight against American or international forces?
I did hear of one case. I didn't get to investigate it myself because, well, I think it'll speak for itself. I did hear of one case where a man's family was caught in an airstrike, and 11 members of his family were killed. And I think he actually did receive help maybe from the Afghan government, and his response to that was to go and arm himself and start firing at the Afghan government and whatever chance he got. So that one kind of backfired a little bit. Obviously, for certain reasons, I didn't get close to investigate whether this was just hearsay or not for security reasons. But this is just an anecdote. But I think there probably are a lot of cases where, that's the response of certain family members, particularly when they're in a desperate situation. I think that influences it, and they don't have any other means to support their family.
Hold on, wait a second. 1 second. We'll come to you, don't worry.
Kate Gould from the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Thank you so much for this tremendous report, and I can't wait to read it. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to kind of your day, an average day for you in Afghanistan, and how you found these people. And I guess I'm imagining that what happened is that these attacks would happen, and then you would, God knows how, get to where these occurred, and talk to the families there. I mean, could you just talk a little bit about, so we can imagine what on earth this must have been like for you?
Yeah. I think it's definitely a difficult environment to be there. I'm a one-man office there, so it's definitely a bit of a challenge sometimes just for basic logistics. In terms of how to find the families, a lot of times we work with different organizations that are already out there, whether it's disability groups that identify them that way, or widow survivor groups. The Human Rights Commission, the APCAT program gave us access to some of their beneficiaries. The UN, whoever is working, whoever we can find that can lead us to some of these families. We actually don't, or I haven't tried to go in and find very many in the immediate aftermath, not only because there's some security risk, particularly since I am on my own to going commando into an area after there's been an airstrike, but more importantly for the purposes of compensation and looking at how families recover and whether they got any help. The real story for us is actually 1 month later, 2 months later, 3 years later, because a lot of times they're not going to get the compensation in the first week. So we did try and catch some families immediately after an incident to try and get a sense of what their initial reaction was. But even in cases where we did that, we also I tried to follow up several months later to see, okay, now it's been 4 months and you've gotten some help, and you haven't gotten some help. What are your impressions now?
It was not a deliberately mean strategy for CIVIC to have her go in by herself. It was just out of necessity.
Okay, ma'am. Yes. It's on, yeah.
I just want to say that 2 years ago, I spent about a week visiting refugee camps in Kabul and outside Kabul, and I met several families whose member had been killed. And Afghans, it's not a new thing, are very angry at the U.S. Because they do not receive any compensation, because they are very disappointed about the way the U.S. behaves, not fulfilling many promises. And several men told me that if the Taliban was going to ask them to join their ranks, that they would do, because they do not see any other solution to get help, and I mean financial help.
Okay, that's a good point. I think there was a question around here. Yes.
Can I make a comment on that point? There's been an interesting shift in strategy for the Taliban and other anti-government forces since the beginning of the initial U.S. invasion in 2001. At that time, it was a real war of perception, and despite the Taliban still, they call the news wires first and they try to play off particular events in their favor, they were going in, from my interviews earlier on, they were going in to help families back in 2001 that were harmed by U.S. airstrikes and other combat operations, because they saw it as strategically important to them. To them, it was a war of perception, and they started to win it. Now, these past couple of years, their strategies have shifted, and it's become a lot more like what we saw in Iraq with suicide bombings, using humans as shields and really terrorizing the population. So now the population is up for grabs, and this is the point when the U.S. and its allies really need to step in and make sure that they're focusing on the local population.
Okay. Amina Ibrahim, Brookings Institution. Most of the compensation schemes you discussed are basically targeted towards people or families who have lost family members or who have been injured. I was just wondering, do any of the compensation programs actually target people who have been forcibly displaced?
No, they do not target alone, unless something else happened that triggered, if they lost a home as well, which is often a cause of displacement, or they lost a family member and that's why they were afraid and fled, then that would be compensated, but not the actual displacement itself. That kind of falls more within the ambit of things like Norwegian Refugee Council or UNHCR or organizations like that.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, well, I think that I echo Dennis in applauding the work that CIVIC has done generally, but in Afghanistan specifically, and with this report, because it's true that there are a lot of challenges in implementing these recommendations that you have in mind, but still I think they're very good ones. And the fact of the matter is that we have to try, because clear that civilian casualties, and more relevantly, what happens to civilians after the fact, is a main driver of rapidly declining sentiment toward the U.S. and toward international forces. So I think it really needs much more attention than it's getting. So I applaud what you do, and I think I echo Dennis in that case as well, and many others as well. So why don't you join me in giving a round of applause to the speaker and the commentator. And thank you again for coming. If you haven't taken a report outside, if there are any left, you should.